evolution is the next unit that we begin to talk about, and it comes really nicely after talking about DNA, because it turns out that DNA is one of the main reasons that evolution can occur at all. But before we get into all of that, we do need to give honor to the word evolution itself, and the idea that for some people the word brings up certain emotions or certain questions. And so we want to go ahead and define evolution. Evolution is really just known as change over time. And so sometimes the word evolve is used to describe something that has evolved. So fashion has changed over time. Fashion has evolved. Cars have evolved. Music has evolved. And so we can use the word evolve just to talk about change over time. But if we really want to apply it to biology, if we want to use the correct scientific definition, we have to be a little bit more specific. We have to be able to identify that really it's a change in the genome or the gene pool. Because although we can have mutations within an organism, the bigger idea is actually that a population changes over time. In science, it's kind of frowned upon to say an individual has evolved. Because even though you might grow and you might develop, evolution really refers more to changes in the genome and the gene pool. And so we really say that the smallest unit in biology that can evolve is a population or a group of organisms. And really, we're referring not just to time, like 1 second, or 10 seconds, or 10 minutes, or 10 days. We're talking really more about generations. So the most accurate biological definition of evolution has to do with a population's gene pool changing over generations. And that's how we know that something has evolved. So we want to give honor to the word evolution and how it's used colloquially, but we also want to try to be really specific about how we're using the word evolution in biology class. So when we start to look at how life has evolved, there are a couple of really important patterns that we have to talk about first. And then we're going to get into actually natural selection. So it turns out that natural selection, which we'll focus on in the next lecture, is the mechanism for change. Or one of the mechanisms. This idea that certain organisms survive better, sometimes natural selection is called survival of the fittest, or survival of the best fit. And so we're going to look a little bit more at this idea of natural selection as we go through and we look at what is actually choosing who survives best. A big theme that we need to understand is the idea that life may have started with a first group of cells. And so we need a little historical timeline here. About 4.6 BYA, billion years ago, it's believed that the Earth formed. The Big Bang Theory, whether the Earth came off of something else, fractured off of another planet. But the idea is that we can date fossils, and we'll talk about dating fossils later. We can date fossils to 4.6 billion years ago. The earliest fossils of life, these are called microfossils. And these are going to not even be like bones, but just the idea of remnants of a cell, so usually an impression, or about 4 billion years ago. And so we do need to just talk a little bit about how life has evolved, and then we're going to come back to looking at how that actually happens. So just a little timeline is that the very first cells that originated were prokaryotic, simple cells. Think about what it means to be prokaryotic. It means you don't have a nucleus, you don't have complex parts. You are the bicycle right? You get us there, you work, you function, but you're not the fancy Ferrari. And so the very first cells were simple cells. Now go back to your unit on macromolecules and think about, well, all that a cell is a membrane, a bunch of lipids surrounding a nucleic acid with a way to build proteins. So this unit does bring up a lot of really important questions about what it is, what does it mean. And so we're going to have to kind of start with just taking some things at face value. The first cells, the first fossils we find show simple cells. They also show cells that were heterotrophic, meaning these are the first cells that were the first cells consumed food. They weren't able to make food. They didn't have the enzymes to perform photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. They just consumed other molecules around them. And that the first cells were what we call anaerobic. And this is because there was no free oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. So when we look at evolution, we actually want to go all the way back to what were the first living things and look at how these living things have changed over time. Keep in mind that evidence does not support that there was one very first cell, but actually that the very first cells happened in approximately the same timeline, about 600 million years after the Earth formed. So we've got an empty Earth for about 600 million years. And then we start to see evidence of organization and organisms that can reproduce. The next big trend that we see are still prokaryotic cells, but they're actually autotrophic. And so we see that here at about 3 billion years ago. So a billion years later, we actually start to see organisms that can perform photosynthesis, that can make their own food. And then very quickly subsequently, we see the evolution of aerobic organisms. We have to keep in mind, evolution does not mean that this changed into this. It means that as these cells reproduced, they accumulated changes, mutations, variation, and those variations helped them better survive in different ways. So we're seeing the accumulation of mutations. That's really what evolution is. And keep in mind, mutations are random. This cell cannot sit here and wish and hope to have the enzymes to perform photosynthesis. So these are kind of the big trends that we see. We're still prokaryotic, but now we have variety. And if you go out and you study prokaryotic organisms, you see some prokaryotes that are heterotroph and anaerobic, some prokaryotes that are heterotroph and aerobic, some prokaryotes that are autotroph and anaerobic, some prokaryotes that are autotroph and aerobic. And we see this huge variety. The final trend that we've seen is the evolution of the eukaryotic cell. And we already talked about endosymbiosis. We already talked about the theory of Lynn-Margulis, supported by evidence, that small cells actually started to live together symbiotically. And we do see the evolution of the animal cell first, because we see the mitochondria in every eukaryotic, and then we see the evolution of plant cells second. Keep in mind, not everything is an animal or a plant cell, but that cells have accumulated changes over time. So, when we start talking about evolution, first we want to know, what is it? What does it really mean when we talk about the word evolution and change over time? And sometimes evolution will result in variety. Sometimes evolution will get rid of variety. So we're going to see trends that are called divergent, evolution that splits and results in variety. We'll also see convergent evolution, evolution that results in one specific type of organism that survives best. And so when we look at best fit, natural selection, survival of the fittest, we are talking about the idea of, where does this organism survive? Can this organism survive? Why do we care about survival? want to reproduce. So the big things to always hold on to is this idea of variety in the gene pool and generations reproducing. So we're going to take just a few minutes and remind ourselves about what variety is. It's a nice review from the genetics unit. It's a nice review from the DNA unit. The next lecture we'll start talking about some theories. You probably remember the scientists who came up with the theory of natural selection, but it turns out that there were lots of other scientists who contributed as well. So what we're talking about real quickly as the end of this lecture is variation, because variation is one of the keys. You'll notice that it's bolded here in the notes. It's a big idea of being able to have the ability to have differences. So what is variation? The word simply means differences. We have to be careful, however. Some differences are genetic differences. Some differences are acquired. The language you speak is a difference, but that's an acquired difference versus the number of fingers that you have, or do you have fingers? That's a genetic variation. And so when we talk about these differences, we really need to be careful about, is this truly genetic or is this acquired? Because genetics can be passed on. Acquired, they can't be passed on. If you survive longer, that does not ensure that your offspring will survive longer. We do need to include the word can. Just because I can roll my tongue does not mean that my children will necessarily be able to roll their tongue. We have to be careful. We have to remember a little bit of genetics there. There's a possibility that I could pass that trait on. And so what we're talking about is, can the successful variation be passed on? Because that means my offspring will also be more successful. And evolution and natural selection really hinges on this idea that we're accumulating mutations. That whatever mutation happens in me and helps me survive better could be passed on to my offspring. Also keep in mind a little theory, a little bit of ideas about meiosis here. And if a mutation happens in my skin cell, will I be able to pass that on? So how does genetic variation occur? The main source of genetic variation is going to be random, and it is going to be mutations. We have to keep in mind that those are random. They're not wished for or hoped for. They can't be caused. The organism has no control over that. We're also going to see things like crossing over, random fertilization, when we're talking about sexually reproducing organisms, independent assortment, things like aneuploidy. Now, mutations happen in all organisms with DNA. Actually, even in viruses. Viruses mutate as well, even though they're not cellular-based. These four are really only going to be found in sexually reproducing eukaryotic organisms. If we look at the effect of variation within a population, why is variation so important to evolution? Variation means differential survival. So when we talk about natural selection and survival of the best fit, if we're all equal, we all have an equal chance of surviving. And so variation allows for differential survival, which also allows for differential reproduction. When we think about a successful human, we talk about money and fame and power. When we talk about successful organisms like Darwin's finches, it's all about reproducing. And that's where we'll stop.